Pozdravljeni. Današnje predavanje, ki ga v okviru ljubljanskih srečanj in humanističnih korespondenc organiziramo na Inštitutu Nove revije, bo gostilo doktorja Holgerja Zaborowskega. Njegovo predavanje pa bo z naslovom Evropa, krize, izzivi in priložnosti. Današnji dogodek se bo odvil v okviru raziskovalnega projekta Hermenevtični problem razumevanja človeške eksistence in koeksistence v epohi nihilizma. In zato smo še posebej hvaležni profesorju dr. Zaborowskemu, da si je v okviru te tematike vzel čas in nam namenil pravzaprav študijo, ki jo preučuje kar nekaj časa in v več filozofskih vidikih. Holger Zaborowski je po študiju filozofije, teologije in klasične filologije na univerzah v Freiburgu, Baslu in Cambridgeu leta 2002 doktoriral na univerzi v Oxfordu in leta 2010 na univerzi v Zignu. Kot predavatelj je deloval na številnih tujih univerzah, najdlje seveda v Oxfordu in Cambridgeu. Leta 2005 pa je predaval tudi na Filozofski fakulteti Katoliške univerze Amerike v Washingtonu, na kar je prevzel mesto profesorja za zgodovino filozofije in filozofsko etiko na Filozofski in teološki šoli v Wallenderju, kjer je bil tudi rektor. Leta 2020 je bil izvoljen v naziv rednega profesorja filozofije na Fakulteti za katoliško teologijo Univerze v Erfurtu. Skupaj z Alfredom Denkerjem je pravzaprav dolgoletni urednik Heidegger-Jahrbuch in Martin-Heidegger-Briefausgabe, ureja pa tudi letopis za filozofijo religije in skupaj z Martinom Rambom vodita projekt Denkbares, ter od leta 2019 pri založbi Wallstan izdajata tudi knjižno zbirko z naslovom, ki je zelo povezana z današnjo tematiko, Koordinate Evrope, ki se je leta 2019 začela z izdajo knjige Heimat Evropa in v kateri je v središču raziskave vprašanje, kako je lahko Evropa dom sodobne in večkulturne družbe. Od leta 2004 je tudi redni član Evropske akademije znanosti in umetnosti. Poleg torej vrste zbornikov v omenjenih edicijah je objavil tudi več monografij, posvečenih filozofiji 20. stoletja, zlasti z področja fenomenologije, hermenevtike, etike in filozofije, religije pa tudi politične filozofije. Za svoje delovanje je na področju filozofije z ozirom seveda na refleksijo družbe, sodobne družbe in njenih izzivov, prejel tudi številne mednarodne nagrade in priznanja. Naj samo še omenim, da je pravzaprav v tem uvodnem seveda začetnem delu, da je v zadnji številki Fenomene z naslovom Človeška eksistenca in koeksistenca v epohi nihilizma, katero je uredil dr. Dejan Komel, tudi članek profesorja Holgerja Zaborowskega z naslovom Misliti Boga danes. Sedaj pa bi predala besedo profesorju. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Manca, for this introduction, and thank you, Manca and Dejan, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming here this afternoon to think about Europe and to think about the crisis, the chances, and the challenges of Europe today. I have to change the presentation. Okay, and there we are. And when Dejan and I talked about the topic for today's talk, we didn't know how urgent and important it is once again to think about Europe. I think I don't have to mention much. If you look at recent events, the last couple of weeks, it is utterly important to think about Europe in a fundamental way. What we notice very often is that when we talk about Europe today, at least in Germany, it may be similar here. I'd be very interested and curious to hear more about this in the discussion as well. At least in Germany, very often the talk about Europe is very pragmatical. It's about certain laws, it's about the role of Brussels, it's about very concrete practical issues. They are very, very important, of course, particularly now. But sometimes, and this is where philosophy can help us, we need to step back and think more fundamentally about Europe as well. And this is what I would like to do in the next 40 or so minutes. If you have any sort of immediate question, please raise your hand, but then we have, of course, time to discuss my presentation as well a little bit further. And I'd like to begin, well, I hope it's not too depressive and it doesn't lead to major depressions. But I'd like to begin by saying that the crisis is actually a sevenfold crisis. I will not go into detail here very much, but I would like to say about each element or each crisis a little bit. There is, first of all, a political and economic crisis. So a crisis in the sphere of politics, in the sphere of economics. I think if you open the newspapers, if you listen to the radio or television and follow current events, it's quite clear what this means. One question here is, where is Europe heading? So we do find in many European countries new forms of nationalism and populism, anti-European tendencies, so anti-EU tendencies, but also more generally anti-European tendencies. And we don't really know, we see there's an ongoing transformation happening, and we don't really understand and don't see yet how this is shaping up, how this is developing, so the direction of this development. It could be maybe in 5 years' time we look back and we realize the current crisis has led to an intensification of the European collaboration, has strengthened Europe. But it could also be, I mean, I'm not a prophet, it could also be that in 5 years' time we look back and we realize that Europe is in an even deeper crisis than it is today. Then we have second crisis, the crisis of the foundation. The question is, what is Europe built on? If you follow literature on Europe, and I've a couple of years ago, because I'm very interested in this question, what is Europe and how do we talk about Europe, I've started to read and then to collect as well books about Europe, and there's so very many about Europe, European identity, the future of Europe, the past of Europe, and so on. And you do find very many different accounts of what Europe is built on. You know, some people emphasize more the Christian or biblical roots. Some other people emphasize more the Greek roots or Latin roots. Others sort of start in modernity and look at the Enlightenment period. So you do find many, many different accounts of Europe, many, many narratives of Europe. But if we talk about who are we as Europeans today, we do need to look at our tradition, our history, and we need to ask the question, what are the foundations? And of course, there is the question, is there even one or identifiable and clearly identifiable foundation? Maybe that's not the case. Maybe we have a number of foundations. Maybe we have to rethink the foundations as well. So that's the second crisis or question. And then we have an internal crisis. So a crisis from within. And this is not so much the perspective of politics or economics. It's more a question of Europeans, people living in Europe. It's the question of what does basically constitute European identity, Europe's identity. And is there such a thing as a European identity? So I would like to distinguish this question of this crisis, the crisis of identity, from the crisis of foundations. Because some people may argue we do have very certain, secure foundations, but still the question of identity is being raised because history doesn't provide us with a means to guarantee or to understand our identities. Then we have the crisis of borders. Again, where are Europe's borders? We talk about this with respect to Russia. We talk about this with respect to Turkey. There are some people who say maybe we should look at the Roman Empire again and include North Africa, have closer contact to North Africa. But clearly North Africa is not part of Europe. So where are the borders? Where do we draw the lines here? And do we really have clear borders? And I will say a little bit about the difficulty of explaining Europe as well. Then we have still the crisis not of the borders, but at the borders. So the crisis of people trying to migrate to Europe, trying to come to Europe. So the question here is, what responsibility does Europe have? And does Europe bear any responsibility for what lies beyond its borders? So do we just build walls and close Europe and then don't care about what's happening beyond those borders? Or do we have a responsibility not just at, but also beyond these borders? We have an external crisis. And as I said, well, I guess with respect to this crisis, I don't really have to say much if you look at Donald Trump and most recent events. The question, what is the role of Europe in global politics? So the geopolitical role of Europe, within the framework of sort of neo-imperial politics, in the US, in Russia, in China, isn't Europe way too small? And what's the future here? What's the role that Europe has? And will Europe continue to play a significant role in the long run, or will basically the 21st century be the century of the US, China, and Russia, perhaps, and Europe doesn't play the sort of role that it has played at least for many, many decades? And then the last crisis is the crisis of the unrecognized crisis, which means that very often, as I said, we talk about very practical issues, but maybe a crisis could also be that the key crisis, the substantial crisis of Europe, isn't fully recognized. That we do have some kind of awareness that there is a crisis of Europe, but that we don't really understand, that we don't really recognize the crisis. And of course, here the question is, what is basically the primary crisis of those 7 crises? And the question is also whether Europe can be defined in purely formal terms as well. So maybe one crisis could be that in our society at large, people don't think much about Europe. They benefit from Europe. And I think we all have benefited from Europe or the European Union, from the idea of Europe, but still there may be a crisis that's not really recognized yet. And in my second part, I would like to talk a little bit about, against the background of those crises, about the problems of defining Europe. Because if you look at many publications about Europe, very often those questions are not really thought about. And then you do have a definition of Europe. I've just read a new book published by a German scholar who almost exclusively focuses just on Greek culture and says, all the problems have already been solved 2,400 years ago, so we just have to go back and then everything will be fine. So he totally leaves out Christianity, he leaves out the Middle Ages or the modern developments and movements and tendencies. And you just wonder if this really works. And he has sort of little summaries in which he defines the essence of Europe. But of course we have to ask ourselves if there is such an essence of Europe that we can so easily talk about. Because we have to have in mind that big ideas such as Europe can also be misused, abused, misunderstood, and can then become very dangerous ideas as well. So is there such an essence? And is Europe merely defined by various functions? That's another question. Do we simply focus on the economic function of Europe? Do we simply focus on the function of preventing war, supporting economic growth and development? Or is this a very limited view, just to focus on functions? And then we do find as well a plurality of purposes in defining Europe as well. So when we talk about Europe, we do have more than just one purpose. So what is the purpose that's most important, that's definite? Is it the economy? Is it the rule of law? Is it avoiding war or preventing crisis, or maybe even laying the foundations for freedom? Then, I've already mentioned this, we have a problem of a geographical definition. If we were in Australia and talked about Australia, the question, what is Australia, is much, much easier than the question, what is Europe, even though there are some questions about certain islands, perhaps in Australia as well. But with respect to Europe, it's very difficult, particularly to look at the sort of eastern border, with respect to, as I mentioned, Turkey and Russia as well. Where are the sort of geographical borders of Europe? Very difficult to simply use geography here. It's difficult as well to use history here as well, because where do you start? For quite some time, when we focus very much on Central, Western, Eastern Europe, Athens is very much at the margins of this. For some people, even outside of the central heart of Europe, what is Europe today. Europe, of course, is not identical with the Roman Empire. And then if we move on, it's not identical with the Holy Roman Empire later on. So what is the historical definition here? Every definition here could be arbitrary, problematic as well, depending on one's viewpoint or one's interests as well. Then there's a problem, I think, in understanding Europe as a community of values. It's very often proposed, this idea, so that Europe is a community of values. I don't really have so much time to go into detail here as well, but I think recent events as well show there is a problem in using the language of values here. Because values can be very superficial. They are very often like a Trojan horse. So you talk about values, but you put very different things into those values, very different understandings. So everyone seems to agree that those values are very, very important, but what those values actually mean and what the meaning of those values is very, very highly debatable and not common as well. And then there is something that has been called by Rémi Braque, the French scholar, the eccentricity of European identity, which is, I think, a very nice way of putting it, because Rémi Braque draws attention to the fact that Europe is, the definition of Europe, or what makes up Europe, is coming from outside. It's coming from the non-European. So from outside, Europe gets many, many impulses. Europe herself came from outside, traveling then to Crete, if you look at the mythological foundations of Europe. So Europe comes from outside. And if you look at the alphabet, if you look at so many, many ideas, they come basically from the non-European, mostly from the Oriental regions or from the East to what we consider Europe. Or if you look at Roman history, you can see that the Romans took up many ideas from the Greeks. And there's this sort of element of eccentricity here as well. Or what is very common when people talk about Europe as being Christian, they forget very often that Christianity didn't originate in Europe, but outside of Europe. So this is the eccentric idea or eccentric identity of Europe. But it causes some problems then as well, or some challenges, and if we want to understand Europe as well. So we can't simply say we can't define then Europe from within. We always have to take into account that Europe is taking up ideas, and then Rémi Braque's thesis is that they are not simply adopted in a sort of unchanged way or simply taken up and sort of repeated. They are changed, transformed into a new context. Then another question of defining Europe is that many European ideas, many things that we consider typically European, are very universal. Sometimes you can read modern science as European, and Europe is defined by modern science. But then one has to say, well, modern science is a very universal phenomenon now. Many of the ideas that developed in Europe are now universally recognized, or at least do have a universal meaning concern every human being, no matter where people live or where people come from. So again, that's a very difficult question as well. We see the universality of European identity. And now the question is, how can we define Europe? How can we find an approach to Europe? And I'd like to present 3 ways of talking about Europe in the following. A formation through difference, through the experience of differences. When I was preparing this, I decided to look at 3 major differences that have come up, have developed in Europe. So basically differences that, so the idea is not simply to say there is a formula that can lead to a certain identity. It's more the experience of rupture, an experience that questions us as well. I was, for a short time, today I would like to do this more systematically. I think another approach would have been, and I think the outcome would have been very similar, would have been to look at 2 important stories that develop and form European identity. They come up here as well, and which leads to what one could call a negative identity. Because very often, and I think this is very often problematic, you do find people defending Europe in a very positive manner, to say, oh yeah, in Europe, modern science was developed, human rights were discovered, human dignity was first formulated, and it's almost a triumphalistic understanding of Europe. But I think if we take our own history seriously, I'm saying this as a German, there is no reason to have a triumphalistic understanding of our history. Many important things have, of course, been developed, discovered, first been initiated, but we still have very many problematic features in our history. And I think 2 maybe important elements of European history here could be the death of Socrates and the death of Christ as well. Because you could say, well, these are basically 2 injustices, acts not of justice, of injustice, that have had an enormous impact on Europe. And you will see here, and I will briefly mention this when I talk about the difference of truth, that a certain basically way of understanding European history is to see that there is an understanding of truth at work in European history, the difference that truth makes, the rupture that truth makes. Look at Socrates when he's defending himself. One of the key words that he's using is truth, that he's telling the truth, and that he's not simply trying to get out of court, and that he's trying to save his life, that he's sort of bearing witness to the truth. So, and Socrates is doing this, and you could say a very similar motif plays a role in Jesus and the Christian history as well, and also in modernity as well, in this sort of Enlightenment period as well. So you could say, and I'm in these attempts to define what Europe is and how we could understand Europe, my claim is not that this is an exclusive understanding, that this is not, could not be said of other regions, other continents, other countries. We can talk about this later, so I would be open to this. But I'm simply saying, well, by looking at this history, we can see these traces in our memory, in our books, in our cultures, in our different monuments, when you walk around, where basically in different ways people were witness to an experience of truth that is extremely challenging, because it could mean, it could imply to sacrifice one's own life, to basically take on disadvantages, to experience a difference that truth makes, that sort of brings one out of a collective of people. I mentioned Socrates and Jesus. More recent figures that I find very, very important here are, for example, Sophie Scholl, the young student who gave her life during the Nazi period in Germany. And I always mentioned her as a very touching, very moving, very important example to my students, because Sophie Scholl was in her very early 20s. She could simply have said to her brother, look, why should we stand up against the Nazis? We're young, we can just continue and have a good life, finish our studies. Even if we don't agree with Nazism, we can somehow find a way of getting on and having a good life and go on holidays. But particularly when she was caught, the day she was caught, she knew that she was really risking her life. Her brother did know this as well. And we have reports from her time in the prison before she was executed, and it's very, very touching. I mean, this very young person in her early 20s, she says, we realized we have to bear witness to the truth. We have to say what is the case. And we knew telling the truth in this particular context could mean to lose one's own life. And she's, of course, a radical example, but you see, this is a tendency. We know that she was reading Plato a lot. She was reading Christian sources, church fathers as well. So these young people were not just protesters, not merely protesters who said, oh, we have to do something against Nazism. They looked for spiritual foundations as well, intellectual foundations. They found them in Greek philosophy. You know, if you read these reports from her prison, when she was imprisoned, it almost sounds, I mean, I don't have a proof, but given her wording, it sounds as if she had just read Plato's Apology, where she's saying, oh, we need to tell the truth. So, and a contemporary example, loosely speaking contemporary, would be Sophie Scholl. Another example, someone whose life I think is very touching, very important, but he's almost forgotten in many contexts. So many young people in Germany, at least, don't really know his name anymore, even though he hasn't been dead for a long time yet. It is Václav Havel, who's you know him as president, as writer, as thinker, as intellectual, as dissident. But if you look at his writings as well, you find a similar emphasis on the difference of truth, where he says, well, we have to tell the truth. We need to find another way of politics, a politics that is helping truth to shine forth, to come about. So not a cynical politics that's just interested in power, but a politics basically of truth. So Havel is another example. And I think there are many, if you look at Slovenian history, if you look at contemporary history, contemporary events, we do find these people who bear witness to the truth. So the difference of truth, I think, is very important. And one could say maybe this is an element of European identity, or this could be one of those elements. And what's important here is that it's not an element that leads to some kind of triumphalism, where we say, oh, we are so great as Europeans and we have all these wonderful things to offer and all the other people in the world don't know anything about this. Because many of those witnesses to truth, or the ones that I've mentioned, but very often we see this even today, defending truth or defending the idea that there is some kind of truth, comes at a certain cost as well. And I think it is related as well, this is the first point, I'm not following this exactly, that what is distinctive of the philosophical tradition, but also religious tradition, is the idea that God is not part of the world, but is radically transcendent. It's wholly other, and the world is basically autonomous. And this is very important for the next point that I would like to mention. And then the third point as well. The second point, and I think it's closely related to the difference of truth. Truth is not merely an abstract concept that somehow exists, but we always talk about then human beings, persons as well, who stand in a relation to truth. And if I look at the person in a certain way is a difference or makes a difference as well. Because as persons, I can talk about human beings in many different ways. I can, of course, talk about human beings as exemplars of a species, as biologists do. And sometimes I can talk about human beings simply as belonging to a certain group of people, or as individuals, still individuals, but as being part of a group of people. And we do this very often. We talk about the people of Ljubljana, or the people of Western Europe, the people of Central Europe, or we identify ourselves as well in those terms by mentioning groups to which we belong. A scientific view very often would focus on this as well and would look at people, at human beings in general terms. And again, that's not wrong, it's very often. But we are not just individuals, we are persons as well. So we are unique, and that's a very different perspective. So if you go to the doctor, you may be interested in the sort of general view. If your doctor makes a blood exam and tells you that the exam is, the results are so unique, and he's never seen before so unique blood results, you may be shocked, because this is the context when we all want to be just example of a species. We just want to be very general. Just we are not so interested in being unique and individuals and persons. We just want to be the average. If the doctor says everything is sort of on average, you just take a breath and say, okay, I'll be fine, no problems. But of course, this is one perspective how we can look at us, but the other perspective is the perspective with respect to our uniqueness. And this is where we as a person, not just as an individual, because being a person is more than just being an individual. Dogs are individuals as well, but they are not persons. And being a person makes a difference as well. And I think in our long history, in philosophy, in literature, in historical events, in philosophy, theology, we do find expressions of, the understanding of human beings as a person, as created theologically or religiously speaking. So human beings then are creatures and are created in the image of God. And this is to say, not as individuals, but as persons, as people who have a name, a first name, a proper name, so are not just simply parts of a general species, but transcend the limits of those species. So this would be a sort of religious take on this. But we do find a similar dimension or similar understanding also in Greek philosophy, for example. If we look at how a culture of freedom, a culture of free human beings was being discovered in Greece 2,500 years ago as well. So this is a certain understanding. We can tell a long story of the discovery of what it means to be a person and a long story of the implications of being a person. And again, the claim is, this is very universal, that every human being is a person. But I think a certain understanding, a certain way of relating to one another, a certain way of organizing ourselves, of organizing the public sphere, comes with this. The conscience plays a role. You could say a long tradition in which, for example, individual human rights were discovered, stands in this context, in which religious freedom was discovered. This stands in this tradition as well, or the concept of human dignity and human rights as well. And I mentioned here reason, responsibility, and solidarity as well, simply as a couple of dimensions of what it means to be a person. Reason, and you can see how this is related to the difference of truth that is at work in your personal witnesses, Socrates, Jesus, Sophie Scholl, or Václav Havel, but also in a culture of science that is under threat now in a way that maybe no one of us would have imagined a couple of years ago. If you look at the US, or if you look at sort of post-truth accounts of what science could be and is. So we do have the person as reasonable, but the person is not just reasonable. If the person is free, a sense of responsibility comes with the person as well. We sometimes talk maybe too much about freedom as if freedom is an absolute entity or an absolute characteristic feature, but freedom is always limited. Freedom needs limits, needs borders in order to be a human kind of freedom, a human version of freedom. So freedom is related to responsibility. And then, of course, human beings do not simply exist for themselves and alone and in solitary existence, but we live always already with one another, for one another, and from one another. So we are relational beings as well. And I think this is a lot more could be said, but I would say particularly if we compare and contrast this to other cultural traditions as well, one could say a certain understanding of a human being has developed in the European context, and this understanding of a human being has validity as well. It goes beyond the European context, but it is very important as well. When we talk about who are we as Europeans, I would like to make the point that not just the difference of truth, but also the difference of a person, the transcending power of a person. Basically, you could say what it means is that in the person we encounter something that cannot be relativized. That's an absolute. This is, I think, what the modern idea of human dignity expresses as well. That the human being is something that is not it's not just something, but someone, a person with an absolute dignity, not just a relativizable worth. And this has to do not just with reason, but also with our sense of responsibility for one another and solidarity with one another as well. And the third difference is the difference of justice. And all these differences are closely related, but you could say, if I read Plato's Republic, you could say this whole book is the long apology. There's a short apology, Plato's work by the name of apology, but the whole Republic is Plato's long apology, in which he basically defends Socrates and is trying to look for justice in a world in which a person such as Socrates was sentenced to death. And if you look closely at it, it's very often forgotten or not really seen. The Republic is basically a long monologue. It's a monologue in which Socrates tells a dialogue. And I think this is an indication that for Plato, the Republic is basically just Socrates telling that, in the past this and this happened, and he was talking to these people. But it's basically he's putting Socrates on stage, thinking about justice, and this is related to the discovery of a culture of freedom, in which the difference of justice plays an important role. So certain rules, and you could say, the long tradition of thinking in certain traditions about what is called natural law, in other traditions the law of reason, or a law that transcends any kind of positive law. That is the foundation for positive law, that helps us to say certain positive laws are unjust. This is this tradition, the difference of justice, the tradition, the rupture in which, again, out of everyday context, the tendency to close things up is interrupted, is broken into, in which we experience something. This may happen, let's say, you encounter, or the parliament is making certain decisions, is making certain legal decisions, there are new laws, and then if you say, well, but it's not just that it's, the law itself, well, it's a positive law, it's valid, but what helps us to say this is not just? What helps us to, for example, or our friends in the US to criticize Donald Trump, or to say, well, what he does is not just. Even maybe there are laws that cover up what he does, or he introduces these laws, or he makes decisions that are perfectly legal. Of course, that's debated at this point as well. It's an idea of justice that transcends the realm of positive laws, the realm of what is sort of the law inaugurated by parliaments and any positive society. So this is one important element when we talk about justice. We do have this idea of the difference of justice as well. And again, we can look at this more philosophically. If we look at the natural law tradition, if we look at the tradition that focuses on the law of reason, or the laws of reason, when more modern philosophers thought that we don't need to refer to nature in order to talk about this law, this justice. We can just look at reason, and reason helps us to find an understanding of justice that goes beyond what is maybe a given law in a society. And again, you see, this is what, when Sophie Scholl says, I want to defend the truth, and I want to bear witness to the truth and tell the truth, she's doing this as well against this background of this understanding of justice, because she would say what happened in Nazi Germany in the early 1940s, there are all laws for this. It's covered by the law, but it's still not just. And she shows in what she does an understanding of justice. You find similar passages in Václav Havel, when he thinks about what he does, that he says, well, we live in a society where we have many laws that are not just because they don't reflect the truth of a human being, but how things ought to be. So justice, the difference of justice, plays an important role. And I think something that's very important here, I mentioned this already a couple of minutes ago, is if you look at the understanding, the biblical or Christian understanding of creation, but I think it's possible to think about this philosophically as well. The biblical religions propose an understanding of God, or God reveals himself, depending on how you look at it, as totally other, as the totally other to creation. So God is not part of the world, as in, say, ancient Roman or Greek popular religion. It's not a part of the world, but totally other. And you could argue that this idea of creation is the very starting point for the understanding of secular society. The world is merely worldly. It's nothing more than the world. It's creation, but it's not divine itself, which means the political is not an absolute. And any kind of totalitarian or religious understanding of the political then is problematic. And you could say what happens is that the political, the worldly, is bracketed. It's sort of just one part. It's not an ultimate reality, but a penultimate reality. And I think this is something that originates. We find sources already in, you could even argue, in Plato. When Socrates sort of, and I would read Plato's Republic as well as showing this idea of, or as allowing us to talk about a justice that transcends any kind of political order. We do find this in the Christian era, and we do find it in the modern development towards a secular society as well, where we distinguish between salvation or the religious sphere and the sphere of political power and the political sphere or the historical sphere. And this is a very important difference. These are two levels that should not be confused. And if we look at the current crisis, we were just talking about Donald Trump's. I'm sorry to talk about Donald Trump so much, but maybe it shows some sort of difference here as well. We talked about the inauguration where Trump used a very religious language, and it was basically almost like a new political theology that he was putting on stage. And I think this is very problematic because we do find very distinctive of our traditions and of the European tradition as well, this distinction between church and religion and politics on the other side, between salvation history and world history. It doesn't mean that these spheres don't interact and don't touch one another, but they are separate. And this seems to be very, very important against any kind of either politicized version of religion or theologized version of politics. And in the last century, we had many examples of those political religions in communism or National Socialism as well. So, and if I look at what comes out of it, it's the culture of the liberal constitutional state, where the rule of law plays an important role, human dignity and human rights. And liberal, speaking English, I notice that particularly in American English, liberal has a very different meaning now, but I'm using liberal here simply in the sense of focusing on human freedom. The state is not there for its own sake. It's not a purpose in itself. The liberal state is basically there for the human being. The end of the state is the human being. It's not the state itself. It's not a totalitarian state that requires everyone to sacrifice one's own life to the state or to subject oneself totally to the state. No, the liberal state is basically a state for the sake of freedom. And I think that's a very important insight here as well, that goes back to this discovery of the difference of truth, the difference of the person, and the difference of justice as well. So next. Seems to be frozen. No. Coming to an end, these are just, and well, given the limits of time, I can just draw attention to some elements that seem to be important when we talk about particularly Europe's future. And with multiculturalism, I don't mean, sometimes this word is used simply to talk about a multiplicity of cultures that do not touch one another, basically of bubbles that are sort of exist next to one another but do not interact. I would use the multiplicity here in a sort of different way, as a multiplicity of different traditions, very often so close to one another that it's impossible to identify, one string and the other string. So basically, it's almost like a stew. Many things came together, and then something new happens, and you can see how this develops in a sort of historical manner as well. And I think, Slovenia is a good example of this, how different cultures come together, get transformed. But I'd be very interested to hear what you say. Or if I look at the German context, we do see this as well. I'm always surprised. As you may know, we have some very new right-wing extremist tendencies in Germany, and particularly this one party proposes an idea of the nation and the German people that's so homogeneous and so frighteningly homogeneous, and that you really wonder. So what do they talk about? Isn't it just a construction of an idea? And because it doesn't take into account that culture is always in development as well. When I talk about culture, I can't talk about some kind of eternal essence of a culture. I need to take time and history and the movement of time into account. And that's the first point here, origin and future. Something that I think is very important as well, to see that our origins and traditions are also not there for their own sake. They are also, we stand in those currents, in those historical movements, and they are oriented towards the future as well. So our past is not, it would just be wrong to have a reactionary understanding of our past. We have to preserve our past, but it's always important to translate it, to build bridges into the future, to think about the challenges of the future. It's a constant process of, and it's so fascinating if you look at the modern development of political ideas, to see that this happens always again and again. If you look at how we found an expression of human rights, or of modern political key ideas such as religious freedom, religious liberty, or the secular, you can see it's always a process of adapting to certain situations and translating a tradition. But we do need to know the origins. If we cut ourselves off those origins, if we are not aware of those origins anymore, and this leads back to discussions we had about the role of humanities today. I think the humanities are incredibly important. I was shocked to read in Germany that a subject such as history is in a crisis, and philosophy and theology have been in a crisis for much longer. So, but history now is in a crisis as well, because it is well known that if you study history, you need to read books, and that's not so popular anymore, it seems. This is just anecdotal evidence, but I think you know what I mean, how important it is for us as people working and interested in the humanities to keep these traditions alive, and to not to preserve them in a way that they die and become very boring, but to translate them into context. Witness and commitment, that's the idea. Again, that sometimes I think one needs to write a book about Europe, not by talking about ideas, but by talking about people. By talking about Socrates and Jesus and Sophie Scholl and Václav Havel and many, many others. Maybe we should include, Alexei Navalny as well, to say these are people who show something about what it means to be European. And it doesn't matter that we find similar people in Latin America or North America or in Africa or Australia or China, but they show us something about who we are in their concrete examples. Because it's, the identity is not something abstract, it's something that we receive from them, that shapes us. So we do need these concrete examples, and we also need commitment, because thinking about Europe is not a merely academic, a dry, abstract exercise, but it requires to act as well in a specific manner. It's something performative, something that should transform us as well. In this project that Manca mentioned, Coordinates of Europe, we try to do a little bit with respect to this by having one summer school at least every summer, and by having little conferences and trying to get people not just to think about Europe, but also to experience Europe and to realize it implies a certain kind of action as well. Then Europe's openness and the language of differences, the difference of truth, the difference of the person, the difference of justice, an idea of justice that's not the idea of a given positive law, I think, and the idea of the eccentricity of Europe also means that Europe is not a closed horizon. If we talk about the person transcends any given horizon. Truth transcends any given horizon, questions us. The experience of truth is not an abstract, merely theoretical experience. I think everyone who's understood something or realizes something is true, or if we look at people showing us or bearing witness to the truth, that's something that sort of requires a certain openness, that opens the horizons. If we look at the Greek word aletheia, it exactly means this openness within which things can show themselves. So I think an important element, and it's a very careful attempt at showing certain elements, certain coordinates here of what it could mean to be European, is this openness towards the transcending power of truth and of the person and of justice, and of what could happen, what can't be sort of maybe foreseen, but what could happen suddenly, the sort of revelation of the person, of truth and of justice. Europe's responsibility, that's maybe something that's important with respect as well to the tendency to have a triumphalist understanding of Europe, where Europe is simply great, to realize European history is a history with very long, dark periods, with many problematic elements, with things that no one could ever be proud of, that we should regret and that should never happen again. And I think responsibility means to take responsibility for this as well, and to take this seriously. Hospitality, I think European culture is a culture of hospitality as well. This is maybe a concrete openness towards other human beings. Hospitality, and I think if we look at even more figures, we do see it's an important element of, you could say, very traditional cultures, but it's maybe an important element for the future as well, to be hospitable. Europe's humanism, again, this is a short reference to something one could say much, much more about this, but the humanistic traditions of Europe, of course, they were very much debated and in a crisis in the last century. Maybe we need to find a new word as well, because there's a certain kind of arrogant humanism, a problematic humanism. Many of the leading National Socialists were well-educated people, could read Latin and Greek and loved to listen to Mozart and Beethoven and Bach. So it's not just, it's important to see education, or a certain kind of education, doesn't solve all these problems. This would be naive. But we do need to take maybe the best of those humanistic traditions seriously, because you could say they are traditions of the person, of the dignity of the person, and we do find, and it has to do with an understanding of our past and our tradition as well. So it's partly directed towards our past, our tradition, about what it means to be human. But it is, and this is the last point, it should be directed towards the future as well. And I have to be a little abstract today, but I think maybe in the discussion, conversation, we can talk about this a little more. If I look at Europe today, I find many traces of despair, of cynicism, of maybe indifference, that people say, look, I can't hear it anymore, or I just want to be left alone, I don't want to talk about certain things. And my idea here is not to come up with strange, superhuman or extraordinary visions, but I do think we need to find sources of hope. And we do need to find ways in which we can communicate this hope. There are, I guess in Slovenia as well, because it's a European Union thing, there are certain Europe schools, European high schools or grammar schools. And then I thought, well, why is not every school a European school? Why don't we think about, at least I know, I'd be curious to hear whether it's the same here, that very often subjects like history are still focusing on the history of specific nations, which of course it's understandable because it's for sort of closest history, but maybe we need to think more about how we talk about these elements, European history, European tradition, what it means to be European in at schools, at universities as well, but in everyday context as well, through partnerships. And if we look at recent decades, I mean, recent weeks and months don't make me very hopeful and very pessimistic as well, but if we look at the decades where we can oversee, I guess there may be many reasons not to lose hope. And I think this may be important as well. If we look at examples in recent history, if we look at, Václav Havel may be a very good example as well, who's writing in, some of the darkest times of Czech or Czechoslovakian history, very hopeful essays in which he expresses the hope that human beings will not merely survive, but that there is a better future possible, that there's a different way of doing politics, a different way of living together possible. I think these people are examples that even in very difficult and dark times, hope cannot and should not be given up, that can still lead us. I finish here. These are some considerations about crisis, challenges, and chances of Europe. They are, given the limits of time, a little abstract, but I think with respect to every element, I think one can look at how one can look at what it means in concrete terms, but I'm sure one can also find concrete examples of what it means, so that what seems to be abstract becomes concrete and maybe gets a face as well. Maybe just think about the persons, the people, persons I've mentioned. I think it's in their faces, in their histories, in their biographies that we can discover these elements, and maybe they can give us an inspiration to not just think about Europe, but to live in European ways. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zaborowski.